You see, the typical Christian critique of the Prophet of Islam is extremely superficial, surface level, and one-dimensional. Things are looked at purely at face value, and then the worst possible motives are ascribed to them, which in reality is only a reflection of the mental depravity of the criticizers. If a psychiatrist shows you an ink blot, and all you see is sex and violence, the problem is you. Summun bukmun umyun fahum la yaqilun. Deaf, dumb, and blind, they have no sense. But it's not your fault. I understand. You are what you read. The Bible is an anthology of sex and violence. So, a man with hepatitis, he doesn't go around blaming other people because they look yellow. He has a disease in his eyes. He is the problem. He perceives the world through his own diseases. So Mr. Wood's analysis is not surprising. This is a man, the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, who is widely regarded by many scholars of Western academia as the most influential human being to ever step foot on the earth. For all of the earthly work of all of the previous prophets put together does not equal to what this one man achieved. D. Brown, a Christian missionary, says, by any standard, Muhammad's achievements were little short of miraculous. Will we just dismiss him on a superficial level? R.B. Smith says that the Prophet was absolutely unique in history. That's a Christian missionary talking. His life is based on history, not mythology or conjecture. And it's not enough to say he was a great genius, he was a good statesman, he was a military hero. There's a lot more to this man. Alphonse de Lamartine says, in the history of Turkey, quote, that is Muhammad as regards all standards by which human greatness may be measured. We may well ask, is there any man greater than he? وَرَفَعْنَا لَكَ ذِكْرَكَ. God reminds the Prophet of this very fact in the Quran. وَرَفَعْنَا لَكَ ذِكْرَكَ. Have we not raised high the esteem in which thou art held? Dr. William Montgomery Watt, who died last year at age 97, widely regarded as the last of the great Western Orientalists, in an interview conducted in 1999, in his 90th year, he finally conceded, quote, I believe that Muhammad, like the earlier prophets, had genuine religious experiences. As such, I believe that the Quran came from God, end quote. In his book, Muhammad at Mecca, he says, to suppose Muhammad an impostor creates more problems than it solves. You see, the vast majority of the Christian criticisms against the Holy Prophet originate from the Medinan period of the Prophet's life. In other words, the last 9 or 10 years of his life. And these primarily revolve around two issues: his marriages and the application of sacred law. The fundamental Christian questions are, how does Muhammad, peace be upon him, go from a suffering preacher prophet in Mecca to a sword-wielding warrior in Medina? How does he go from a passively resistant monogamist to an actively resistant polygamist? The Muslim follow-up question is, did the Prophet change or did the external circumstances change? You see, in Mecca, the Prophet was a persecuted man, a hunted man, a man with no earthly dominion, very much like Jesus Christ in Galilee. Revelations describing societal and political laws were not yet revealed until much later in Medina. Why? Because the Prophet is in no position to enforce political or societal laws in Mecca. He's just a citizen of the city. But in Medina, he was the king, the president, the sultan of the city, recognized and legitimate state authority. And it is the responsibility of the state to enforce laws and exact justice. Read Romans chapter 13. Paul says almost the same thing verbatim. So the prophet in Medina resembled Moses, which is a fulfillment of prophecy. God tells Moses in Deuteronomy 18:18 in Hebrew, Navi akim lahem mikarav achehim komocha, venatati devarai befiv, vedeber aleihim et kol ashrad savanu. I shall raise them up a prophet from amongst their brethren, like unto thee, like you, and I shall put my words into his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. Mr. Wood relates the story of, Asma bint Marwan and many other similar stories in his online writings. Almost all of these stories Mr. Wood has taken from Guillaume's translation of the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq. What he doesn't realize, however, is that most Muslim scholars, the vast majority, consider this biography of the Prophet to be only somewhat reliable at best. He wrote it over 120 years after the death of the Prophet, and it is common knowledge that he took many of these stories from Jewish sources and traditions. If I borrowed a story about Jesus from the Talmud, what would you expect it to say? Yet go to any one of Mr. Wood's online writings about Islam, and you notice the first footnote, Sirat Rasulullah by Ibn Ishaq, and then Ibid, same as above, same as above, same as above. That's all he's got. This story is totally spurious. It's apocryphal. Where is it in the Muwatta or Kitabul Athar? Books written by eminent scholars of hadith. that predate Ibn Ishaq. You see, Ibn Ishaq is a biographer. He's a reporter. He's not a muhaddith. He's not a scholar of hadith. He's not verifying authenticity or chains of transmission. He's relating as much material as possible. There's no sanad for this story. There's no chain of transmission. It's apocryphal. If I said that Jesus was violent as a child because he killed his schoolmates and one of his teachers, you would say, what are you talking about, you stupid Muslim? That's from the infancy gospel of Thomas, from the 2nd century. That's apocryphal. That's spurious. That's pseudonymous. Exactly. Again, we have to be objective in our critical methodology. Same standards apply to both religions. The fact that the prophet practiced polygamy does not invalidate him as a prophet of the God of Abraham. Abraham, Jacob, Moses, Solomon, whatever, 700 wives, according to the Bible, did the same thing. The Jews at the time of Jesus practiced polygamy. And there isn't a single word of reproach uttered against this by Christ in the canonical Gospels. In fact, Islam did not invent polygamy. It restricted and regulated it. The prophet was not possessed. He never attempted suicide. He never raised his hand to a woman, a child, or a servant. He never allowed rape or torture or spousal abuse. He did not commit genocide upon the Jews of Medina. He did not steal his adopted son's wife. He was not immoral. And the satanic verses story is a straight up fabrication. And I challenge anyone who says otherwise. We're just getting warmed up. I have answers for all of this stuff. The prophet did, however, reform and eventually abolished slavery and gave women unprecedented rights even for the 20th century. Mr. Wood's presentation reminded me of the magicians of Pharaoh, right? They're trying to, cast a spell over the audience to create an illusion. But then Moses showed up with the truth. Remember, the Quran says, you will hear much that will grieve you from the Jews and Christians. But you need to show patience and self-restraint. Jesus told his disciples, according to Matthew, blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for they persecuted the prophets who came before you. So the fact that there are people in the world who love the prophet so much that they're willing to die for his cause, and at the same time there are people in the world who love the holy prophet so much that hate the prophet so much that they're willing to die to suppress his cause, is proof enough for me that Muhammad is a prophet. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
Ali argues that Ibn Ishaq shouldn't be used as a historical source. I find this pretty interesting since Ibn Ishaq is our earliest detailed biography of the life of Muhammad. But let's look at Ali's reasons for rejecting it. He says that it doesn't contain a reliable isnad or chain of transmission, but this is just a misunderstanding on Ali's part. The chain of transmission didn't really become important until the 9th century when these theological disputes arose, and people like Bukhari and Imam Muslim wanted to go back and try and find which collections were reliable, and so they came up with a method that you go for the chain of transmission. But Ibn Ishaq was written a century earlier before that became important, so Ali's criticism is really that this material is so early that it arose before the chain of transmission became necessary. Ali says that Ibn Ishaq incorporated material from Jewish sources. That's true, but there are 4 problems with this response. 1, Ibn Ishaq incorporated material from Jewish sources that he considered reliable. 2, Jews know how to write history too. 3, if you want to say that Muslims shouldn't use Jewish material, you're contradicting Muhammad, who told his followers to gather reliable information from the Jews. And 4, the material I'm using didn't come from Jewish sources, and so the entire objection is irrelevant. Ali says that it's apocryphal. Well, it's not canonical. Well, I'm not interested in canonical. I'm interested in historical. And Ibn Ishaq is our earliest detailed source on Muhammad. Ali asks, how would Christians like it if he went to the infancy gospel of Thomas? Let's be clear here. Me going to your earliest detailed biography of Muhammad is nothing like you going to the last, worst information about Jesus. Those situations aren't similar. Let's move on to the satanic verses. Ali has painted a beautiful picture of Muhammad with all those references. The problem is, Ali is very selective in the details that he shares. Some people call this the Walt Disney version of Muhammad. And, it's not going to work in a debate. Here's why. Let's suppose I'm thinking of a man named John Gacy. He entertained children at birthday parties. He held neighborhood barbecues regularly. He He helped people. He worked with local charities. He worked with youth organizations like the JCs and the Boy Scouts. He helped all kinds of people. He helped young people find jobs. And I could go through and show all these wonderful things about John Gacy. But if I want to say he's a great man, I can't leave out the fact that he raped and killed 30 boys. Those things are important. And if you want the complete picture, you have to go to all the details, not just the good things. If we just go to the good things, we can make anyone in the entire world look good. Next, I argued that Muhammad was not a man of peace. I pointed 1 to Muhammad's assassinations and executions, 2 to his torture of Kanana, and 3 to the fact that Muhammad allowed his men to have sex with their female captives, which in the modern world would qualify as war crimes, even though it's in the Quran. Ali says that this is just a smokescreen. Really? Muslims tell me that Muhammad was a gentle prophet of peace. I go to your earliest sources, and it doesn't matter which sources you go to. There's plenty of material there. I go to Ibn Ishaq because it's the earliest. That's why I go there. And I go there and I find Muhammad ordering his followers to assassinate men and women who insulted him, who wrote poetry against him. I find people being brutally tortured. I find Muhammad telling his followers that it's okay to have sex with female captives. Ali says this never happened. Well, I've got 4 pages of references here from the Quran, from Sahih al-Bukhari, from Sahih Muslim, and from other of your most reliable sources saying, yes, it did. Ali says that Muhammad was violent because he was head of state. We need to be realistic here. Muhammad was ordering his followers to sneak into people's houses and assassinate them. Is that part of his job description? Muhammad was killing people during caravan raids. What does this have to do with being head of state? Muhammad sent assassins to Mecca. He wasn't head of state there. When Muhammad took Mecca, several people were executed for insulting him years earlier before he had any political power at all. So they weren't guilty of any crimes against the state. And what do you do with a man who was executed simply for saying that he would never become a Muslim? Ali says that Muhammad was gentle. That's probably the last word I'd apply to Muhammad for some of these things. I'll give you an example. If you don't like Ibn Ishaq, here's one from al-Bukhari. This is interesting because Ali claims again that Muhammad was gentle. 8 men once came to Medina. They converted to Islam, but they got sick, so Muhammad told them to go drink some camel's urine. And they did, and apparently they felt better. But then they left Islam, and they killed Muhammad's shepherd. And guess what the peaceful, gentle prophet did when he caught these men? Now, they were guilty of murder, okay. But guess what he did? He tied them up. He had them tied up. He had their hands and feet cut off. He burned their eyeballs out with hot nails. And then he left them in the hot sun to die of thirst. Now, I'm willing to lay this down as a rule. If you burn out people's eyeballs with hot nails, you're not gentle. You want to know who's gentle? Mr. Rogers was gentle, no burning people's eyes out. Ali says Muhammad never sought revenge. Well, you can say that. I'm going to early sources and I see something different. He says Muhammad was just a king. His circumstances changed. Yes, he went from being in Mecca where he couldn't possibly have won a fight to going to Medina where he could win a fight. So you can't look at the Meccan period and say he was peaceful because he didn't fight. That could just mean he's smart enough to realize, hey, I better not fight because I'm going to lose. So that's not very good evidence that he was peaceful. Next, I pointed out that Surah 4:3 tells Muslims that they can have up to 4 wives, but that Muhammad had a lot more than 4 wives. Ali responded to the issue of polygamy. I didn't criticize Muhammad for polygamy. I criticized him here because he told his followers that they were allowed to have 4 wives, and then he had more. So this was really an inconsistency, and I said that it looks pretty suspicious when he received the revelation saying that he could have more. Biblical prophecies. He points out that there are names and words that look like Muhammad. Well, I mean, think about how this works. I mean, my name's David Wood. If I want, think about an English Bible, I can find David and Wood all over the Bible. You could find a prophecy of anyone. I mean, think George Bush. Could you find a prophecy about God appeared to Moses in the burning bush? This is a clear prophecy that God's mode of revelation to the world was through a bush. So, and who could this be? It's a clear prophecy of George Bush. I don't think that's a good prophecy. But actually, the entire argument from biblical prophecies is pretty easy to refute. Because Ali believes that Deuteronomy 18 predicts the coming of a prophet after Moses. I agree. But by granting Deuteronomy 18, Ali has just ruined his case for biblical prophecies. Verse 18 says that God will raise up a prophet like Moses. Unfortunately, just 2 verses later we read this. But the prophet who speaks a word presumptuously in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or which he speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. So we see 2 things here. 1, if a prophet says something that I have not commanded him to say, or 2, if he speaks in the name of other gods, he's not a prophet. Muhammad did both when he revealed the satanic verses. Ali says it never happened. I gave 8 sources, plus al-Bukhari as confirmation. So according to history, this really did happen. And according to this passage, which Ali grants is inspired by God, Muhammad cannot possibly be a prophet. And so I would say that we're all amply justified in rejecting Muhammad a prophet, especially if you believe in the Bible. Time's up.